Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Last night, there were primaries in several states, including a highly anticipated one in Maine, where Graham Platner officially won the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate. He will be facing incumbent Senator Susan Collins in a must-win race for the Democrats this fall. Let's talk now with someone who knows everything about the primary season inside and out, about what we've learned, what's ahead. That would be David Nir, who publishes the Downballot on Substack, and he has been watching national, state, and local elections for years. David, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and start with Maine, since that's been top of mind for many Democrats. Last night, I don't think it really came as a surprise that Graham Platner won. I know Janet Mills and there was still on the ballot. There was another candidate, but he had pretty well locked up support in spite of a series of scandals. So what should we be looking for as now our attention turns to November?
This was very much the preseason, Susan, because as you say, Platner did not really have serious opposition on the ballot. Now, the strength of his candidacy did manage to convince Janet Mills, the sitting governor who was term limited, to drop her campaign a few months ago, though her name did, as you say, still appear on the ballot, and that can't be ignored. But the strength of Mills's campaign was weak. She never really managed to land a blow on Platner. She ran some negative ads, didn't have a ton of money, didn't get a lot of traction. It's going to be very, very different in the general election. Republicans are not in a position like Janet Mills was to choose to give up. They are going to defend Susan Collins with every last dollar that they have. And they are going to hammer Platner in a way that he hasn't been hit before. Now, I know it's very easy to say, well, all this stuff has already been out there for months and months. People know about it. But the fact is, normal voters don't pay attention to this stuff the same way that you and I do, the same way that listeners to this show do. And so folks who haven't been really directly exposed to all the stories about Platner are going to start hearing about them, and in a way that they haven't before. And the real question is going to be whether Platner stands up to the new scrutiny that is going to come with massive spending attached.
Yeah. And I've been watching that Fox News has already been hammering him long before this New York Times story that went into Platner's history with women. But Fox News has been devoting a lot of time to attacks and basically running Susan Collins's campaign. And this was before last night with the primary. I can only imagine that this will become a huge focus for right-wing media as we're heading into November, because this is just a must-win flip for Democrats.
Yeah, I think that the Fox News outlets of the world, they can certainly motivate a certain portion of the GOP base, but I think this is going to be fought on a much wider playing field, because you're looking at the entire electorate now, including lots and lots of people who don't really regularly watch the news, whether it's Fox or a mainstream channel. And so it's as existential for Democrats as it is for Republicans. But to be clear, Democrats are devoting tons of resources to this race too. The question here is that Collins is now seeking her sixth term, and she has somehow always managed to defy political gravity. Will the hits against her be sort of brushed away as, oh, same old story? Or will Democrats find effective ways to attack her and reduce her popularity by, for instance, tying her to the extremely unpopular acts of the Trump second administration? So we're going to see. We know what the hits on Platner are going to look like. What will the attacks on Collins look like, and will they be more effective than those in the past?
Well, let's move down to South Carolina, where Lindsey Graham was able to survive a tough primary challenge against Mark Lynch. And I know this was a race that you were following down at the down ballot. And we're looking to see if he might become the next Bill Cassidy or Thomas Massie. But he did survive, and Lindsey Graham kind of put his bet on trying to be Donald Trump's shadow years ago. It seems to have been effective. But talk to us about the contours of this race.
Yeah, so Lindsey Graham did win and he avoided a runoff, but he won with about 57% of the vote. And in a general election, if you win 57% of the vote, you've done fantastically. That means a double-digit blowout. But in a primary, 57% is pretty unimpressive. And the reason why I say that is if you, in ordinary circumstances, take a poll and you ask Republicans what they think of a Republican politician, or you ask Democrats what they think of a Democratic politician, usually you get 80 to 90% support among members of your own party. So if that drops to 57%, that's a real indicator of a lack of support among the people who should form your base. And this has been true throughout Lindsey Graham's career, despite, as you pointed out, tying himself to Donald Trump, becoming Trump's shadow, as you put it. He still is mistrusted by the GOP base. And the fact of the matter is that Republicans, his allies, spent $15 million to make sure that he wouldn't have to face a runoff in this primary. That's money that they simply won't have in a general election. Now, I don't want to suggest that his weak performance in the primary means that he's going to lose the general election. These are two extremely different races, but he does face a serious opponent in Democrat Annie Andrews, a pediatrician who's already raised a lot of money for her race. Meanwhile, Graham had to spend most of his war chest on his primary. South Carolina is a very difficult state for Democrats. We know this, but I think Graham is probably going to have to sweat the general election a bit too.
Well, one of the more amusing results, I think, for all of us last night was also in South Carolina, where Congresswoman Nancy Mace didn't just lose the primary for governor, she finished fifth. Like, she was even left off of a lot of tallies on the news. She was
Yes,
that far
right.
behind. And, Nancy Mace famously did stand up to Trump once by becoming a major proponent of releasing the Epstein files. And her reward for that was that Donald Trump did not endorse her in this race. Although, let's be honest, she was facing long odds even without that. So can you talk with us about how this all went down? Because at one point, she was even being talked about to have a national profile, maybe to run for president. And now it seems that her career is over.
Her career is definitely over. It's certainly over in the House now. She doesn't get to run for re-election. She shot her shot and she missed. There was a lot of glee in many quarters of the internet last night about not just this defeat, but its humiliating nature. I mean, as you said, if you went to the New York Times results page last night, you actually had to click show more candidates to even be able to see Nancy Mace's fifth place finish. And you just put up a graphic comparing her fifth place finish to Riley Gaines's notorious fifth place finish. And this was just truly humiliating for Mace. You're right. I don't think that Trump endorsement necessarily would have saved her, but that never seemed likely. She's had such a weird on and off relationship with Donald Trump, occasionally posing as an antagonist, and then a bit like Lindsey Graham trying to suck up to him. I think that MAGA voters, they can tell authenticity, and they know who's a true believer and who is just faking it for their votes. And Mace always came off as the latter, and media reports back this up. So I can't say I was surprised to see her crash and burn like this. And Susan, there's one other really remarkable detail that after she lost, she endorsed State Attorney General Alan Wilson, one of the two candidates who made it into the runoff, even though earlier in the race, she had accused Wilson in his role as AG of refusing to prosecute men who she alleges sexually assaulted her. So this is someone who is not grounded, does not have any core values, and Congress will not be poorer without her.
Yeah. I've watched her evolution, and I think part of it goes back to the fact that when she was elected, she was in a relative swing district. And then, of course, it got redistricted into a solid red, area. So clearly she saw the writing on the wall, and attaching herself to Donald Trump most of the time was a benefit. But, several years ago, she was one of those people that the DC press gave outsized attention to. And she was supposed to be the new face of the party, the post Trump party. And, she was supposed to have principles where she supported LGBTQ rights to an extent and women's rights to an extent. And that made her an outlier. And then something happened, maybe she's, going through some things in her personal life. Certainly some reporting indicates that, where a lot of staffers have come out and they've dished on her with her alleged drinking and, with her behavior and how she treats her staff. And, I really saw just a huge flip in the kind of coverage that she got, which I'm sure was not helpful to her gubernatorial bid. But is this a case where you can only fool people for so long, even in Washington?
So Mace also had some primary challenges over the years for her House seat, and I think that maybe more than anything else drove her to this Trump sycophancy. I think that I would maybe take a step back here and point out that in Washington's press corps, there is always a drive, always an urge to find the next reasonable Republican. And I put reasonable in air quotes, someone who does not look and sound like Donald Trump or some of the most feral members of the congressional GOP. And, we've seen this for years and years and years. Paul Ryan, for instance, was the great policy wonk hope, but his plans turned out to be just as right-wing as anyone else's. And we've seen this happen on so many occasions. And Nancy Mace was the latest beneficiary / victim of this urge, this need that the Beltway press corps has to prop up these Republican standard bearers who look and sound more normal. And the problem is that there just really aren't, especially in Donald Trump's party. There has been absolutely no one who has been able to maintain that sort of reputation and stay in office at the same time. We saw it with Mitt Romney, who had to leave office after just a single term in the Senate. We saw it with Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, very similar story. There are many others that we can point to, and there just is no one who can present an alternative to Trumpism from within the GOP as long as Trump still holds his sway over the Republican Party.
Are there any other possibly endangered Republicans who may have tangled with Donald Trump or offended MAGA in some way that we should be keeping an eye on in some of the primaries to come?
There always are some races where someone you didn't really expect to get mugged at the ballot box winds up falling afoul of some far-right candidate. Even it often happens with candidates who don't have much money and don't have much support, but for whatever reason, the incumbent office holder has offended the MAGA base. And the fact is that if you are a member of Congress, and particularly if you've been there for a while, you've almost certainly had to make the kind of compromises and cast the sort of votes that poison your reputation with purist primary voters. And perhaps the best example, I think, was John Cornyn, who got absolutely torched by Ken Paxton in that Senate primary in Texas. And there was a great quote from a former Cornyn aide who said, "How can you be Mitch McConnell's best friend for 18 years and then be Donald Trump's best friend for 18 months? The answer is that it doesn't work." So right now, there's no one in particular I would point to and say, oh yeah, watch out for this one right off the top of my head. But there will be some more Republican incumbents who turn in these Lindsey Graham-like performances or worse because they aren't trusted by primary voters.
That's really interesting, and just kind of shows us how MAGA continues to just devour this party. And the moderates were gone a decade ago. Now they're moving on to just anybody who came from more traditional Republican circles pre-Donald.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think you've nailed it. It's probably far outside the scope of this episode to discuss what the GOP looks like after Donald Trump, but that day will come one day. I think there will be a major succession crisis, as it were, as everyone vies for his mantle. But I think your term is exactly right. Trumpism has devoured the GOP. It's a cult of personality. And we see the dangerous and poisonous fruit that this yields because Trump is extremely unpopular and the entire GOP is extremely identified with him. And so I think that Trump's massive unpopularity, we've seen it in the polls of all sorts, is going to really hurt the GOP at the ballot box this fall.
Well, you called last week's primary contest the biggest primary night of the year. There were 6 states that voted, including California, where they're still counting ballots.
Yep.
And Republicans are stirring up all sorts of conspiracy theories there. Talk with us. Let's start with the gubernatorial race there. And were you expecting it to break down this way?
It depends on when you would have asked me that question, because this one changed fast and hard and late.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, Eric Swalwell's implosion was quite spectacular. That's the former congressman who was accused of sexual assault by multiple women, but to drop his campaign. And then Javier Becerra, who was Joe Biden's former health secretary and former state attorney general, kind of emerged almost out of nowhere to surge into first place. And in fact, just last night on Tuesday night, we had the AP call for the general election. And so Becerra will face former Fox News host Steve Hilton in November. There looked like an outside chance that a second Democrat might wind up in the general election. That's billionaire investor Tom Steyer. But the later counted votes were helpful to Steyer, but not enough. And so Hilton was called for the second spot. And for Becerra, boy, was it a charmed outcome, because given how blue California is and given the way that 2026 is shaping up, as we were just discussing, he is the overwhelming favorite. I mean, a near lock to defeat Hilton. And, you also referenced the GOP conspiracy theories about the vote counting. I don't think it's great that California takes as long as it does to count. It could count faster. A big part of this is the fact that the state and local governments don't devote the necessary resources to their election officials. This is a huge problem across the country, that our election officials are critical infrastructure for democracy, and they need much more financial support from local governments. But the fact of the matter is that the patterns we've seen in California, where later counted votes are almost always bluer, we've known that for years. This is not a surprise. And so the outcome, for instance, in the Los Angeles mayor's race, where a far-right reality TV star got overtaken by a progressive candidate in the race against the city's Democratic mayor. Right? I mean, this is a town that's 70-80% Democratic. Obviously, these are nonsense conspiracy theories. And what I want to say is that even if you believe that California should make greater efforts to counting votes faster and improving its infrastructure, as I do, it's very important not to simply respond to conspiracy theories as the reason, because then you're making them the protagonists. That these fake narratives about untrustworthy results, that cannot be the reason why you decide to improve the counting system. You have to do it for good reasons, not false reasons.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little more about the gubernatorial race, because I think you had something like 61 candidates, which is insane. It's a large state, but that's still a ton of candidates.
Yeah.
California is a little different than many other states where they have a jungle primary. So it's the top 2 vote getters. And when Democrats were overwhelming the field, Swalwell was still, a big factor. There was the nightmare scenario where Democrats could have gotten locked out of the 2 top slots, and you would have a Republican governor of one of the bluest states in the country. That nightmare scenario was avoided, but as a result of having such a divided Democratic base, that's something I hear a lot of Democrats are talking about, like, how can we avoid this in the future? And that's a difficult proposition because you've got a ton of talent in the state, a lot of ambitious people. You still have term limits. So a lot of people who are looking for a place to go and in a way that they can keep their careers going. But another factor that was really interesting that seemed to emerge in this race, and I would expect to become more and more of a national trend, is you had so many influencers who were involved. And there were some articles about how Tom Steyer was paying people, which, you know, he has the money to do it, but he's certainly not the only candidate to go that route. But I think that this seems to be more and more of a strategy in politics, is to cultivate influencers, because that is where a lot of people get their news, especially younger people. And I'm wondering, because you are the one who is covering so many of these races, how you're seeing all this play out.
So I think you asked two separate questions there.
Yes.
About the top two primary and about influencers. Let's talk about the top two primary for a moment. Ever since California adopted this, and it's in the state constitution as the result of a voter approved amendment to the Constitution. This was back in 2012, was the first year that it came into force. The possibility of a lockout for either party has always been there, and in fact has happened in some critical races. We have seen Republicans get locked out of statewide races for Senate twice, and we've seen Democrats get locked out of at least one critical race for the House. This was back in 2012 in a very winnable seat. What you could say is that at least in the statewide race as well, Republicans are exceedingly unlikely to win those. But you know, I don't think that's a good excuse. And there have been, like I say, winnable races for the other side where there have been just no options for Democratic voters. And what we have seen over the last few months, more than any time I can recall over the prior decade, is Democrats in California talking about reverting to traditional party primaries, which are used in almost every other state. And to do that, you would need another constitutional amendment. Now, the legislature could simply vote to put an amendment on the ballot sometime in the near future. Convincing voters to support it, that's a different question. I'm not really sure how people would feel right now, but this near miss with the gubernatorial race, I think probably is going to spur more conversations about reforming, if not undoing, that system.
And then my other question was just the contours of
the
Democratic primary, where you were saying influencers become, I think, a pretty significant factor, especially with such a huge field, and everybody was trying to get their name out there.
Yeah, you know, we have seen a lot of people in recent years emphasize talking to voters, quote unquote, where they're at, meeting voters where they're at. And that often means finding the new platforms that voters are getting their news from, or even if not news, just getting information from in general, spending time on. And you know, I came up in an era where the political blogosphere was just getting its sea legs 20 years ago. And I remember quite well how most of your establishment politicians had no idea what we were all about. There was a lot of disdain. In the traditional media, we were viewed as kind of a wild west of upstarts. And then slowly but surely, a few politicians and a few institutions started to embrace this new online world. In particular, they also discovered that there was a lot of money to be raised online. And it wound up having a profound impact on the politics for both parties, I think, especially Democrats, who developed a very early lead in grassroots online fundraising. And so I think we're still in early days of influencers right now. And they are, in, I think, a lot of ways, less overtly political than the original blogosphere was 20 years ago. I think we'll just have to see how things play out. You know, where I would expect them to have the greatest impact is in smaller races, because as you have pointed out, the California electorate is just so huge, and there were so many candidates, and standing out from the crowd is so difficult in such a big state and in such a big race that I think we can expect to see these kinds of newer media platforms have a bigger impact for House races or even local races.
Well, I know that you originally had your publication Morning Digest, and it was acquired by the Daily Kos, became Daily Kos Elections. And so you're definitely from that world. And now you have the Downballot. And Let's talk about your publication a little bit and what you do, because I come from traditional media where so many local media outlets have been decimated across the country, and a lot of especially local elections don't get their due anymore, and people are searching for good information. So talk to us a little bit about what you do with the down ballot day in and day out.
Absolutely. So every day we publish a newsletter that you mentioned called the Morning Digest. It comes out Monday through Friday and it's free of charge. And in that newsletter, we wrap up the latest developments on all of the most important down ballot races happening across the country. We like to say from Senate to City Council. So we start with all the congressional races, but we're also covering governor's races, House races, and races for other posts that are extremely important that never get enough attention, like state attorney general, state Supreme Court, secretary of state, ballot measures, which we've been talking about. And we scour the news. We read tons of other publications, tons of newsletters, social media, press releases. We get some tips from readers and from folks in the industry. And then we figure out what actually matters and what doesn't. And Susan, there is so much fluff and nonsense out there. There are so many stories that the traditional media obsesses over that wind up not mattering at all. And conversely, that means that there are some very important stories that never get enough attention from the traditional media. And we try to strike the right balance and only convey the information that we think is actually going to be meaningful in terms of determining the outcome in an election. Because you have, for instance, these bogus scandals or these silly endorsements that aren't actually ever going to move voters. What actually does move voters? Well, maybe it's a really serious scandal. Maybe it's a really important endorsement. Maybe it's someone dropping out of a race and backing a candidate who's still running. And so these are the kinds of things that we try to cover, the hard news that is actually going to move voters. And we do this 5 days a week. You can find us at the-downballot.com. And I encourage every listener to sign up and read us, because there really is no other source of information on all of these races all in one place every single day.
Well, one of the historic knocks on Democrats has been that they have not devoted the same amount of time that Republicans have of building the bench at the local level. I mean, we've been watching how a lot of conservative Republicans have been targeting school board races. They've had some success. They've had a lot of failures, but it's been very important for them to try and shape the discussion about how race and how LGBTQ rights are taught in schools. And of course, during the pandemic, what the health response in schools was. But long before this, back in the 70s, this has long been a huge priority for the right to influence politics at the level that's closest to people, while a lot of Democrats have their eye on what goes on in Washington, D.C. Are you seeing this change?
This is such an astute point and something that has troubled me for decades. You're exactly right. But to answer your question, yes, it has started to change, in particular with the rise of Donald Trump, because after 2016, all of a sudden you had a lot of folks, including many who were new to politics, say, whoa, 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 something really terrible just happened for our democracy. What are we going to do about it? And Donald Trump wasn't going to be on the ballot again for another 4 years. But there were many down ballot elections, particularly the 2018 midterms, but many others as well, where folks could make a difference right away. And so starting right after Trump's win in 2016, all of a sudden we started seeing a huge surge in interest in these sort of races for things like state legislature, for things like state Supreme Court and those other offices that I was mentioning earlier, and other areas of the ballot. We have hundreds of thousands of elected posts in the United States. It's pretty wild. And so there are always elections happening somewhere. All this said, you're right that on the left, there has long been too much of a focus on the White House and on the powers of the presidency. It's sexy, it gets all the attention. Whereas on the right, they have spent decades devoting their energies to winning power at the unsexiest levels. And not only does it create a bench of candidates for higher office, but these local and smaller offices, these statewide offices, have tons of power in their own right. We saw it, for instance, with the Wisconsin Supreme Court, where thanks to conservatives winning a majority on that court back in 2008, that court wound up greenlighting years and years of GOP power grabs by the state legislature, including gerrymandering and assaults on voting rights and union rights. And it took 15 years for progressives to win back a majority, which they did in 2023. And we've already seen major changes as a result of that new look Supreme Court, particularly in regard to gerrymandering. Wisconsin now has fair maps for its state legislature. And that's just one example. I could point to many others, but it will take a very long time to undo those decades of conservative effort at the local and state level.
Well, let's talk some more about gerrymandering, because obviously we had an extremely significant case. The Calais case was just decided by the conservative Supreme Court, which gave the green light to race-based gerrymandering across the South. States like Tennessee and Alabama wasted no time in trying to redraw their maps. You've been covering this in depth at the Downballot and have been chronicling how this has just decimated majority Black districts down South. What do we need to know about this fight and how we go forward?
So there are two things that I want to stress here. First is that the congressional gerrymandering by Republicans in southern states in response to the Calais case has gotten the most attention, and understandably so. But the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the far-right supermajority in the Supreme Court, did not just apply to Congress. It, in fact, applied to every map used for elections across the country, just about every map. And so we are talking about thousands and thousands of political bodies that use these kinds of district-based maps. It could be something like your city council, your state legislature, your county board of commissioners, a school board. And all of these had been required to comply with the Voting Rights Act, which at its most basic level says you can't simply take a group of minority voters and chop them up among multiple districts to dilute their voting strength. That is a very oversimplified way of putting it, but that's maybe the core of the VRA and what the Supreme Court gutted. So what we are going to see in the coming years is attacks on all of these other maps, decimating Black and Latino and Native and Asian American districts all across the country at many levels of the ballot. The other thing I want to stress is there is no legislative fix to this for Democrats, even if they take back Congress and the White House in 2028, because almost any bill that any legal expert can imagine coming up with to replace or improve the VRA would simply get struck down again by the far-right majority in the Supreme Court. What that means is that the top priority for Democrats has to be Supreme Court reform. And there are many, many forms that could take. I don't have strong opinions about what the best way to do that is, but it has to happen, because otherwise things like the Voting Rights Act can never be restored.
It's a sobering thought, because, you know, for up until the last decade or so, the Voting Rights Act was not considered to be controversial at all. It was renewed by Congress by huge majority votes across parties. But it really does show the stakes for where we're at with the next couple elections. So let's take a look. We're mostly through the primary season, but there are several states that still have primaries to come. What are some of the interesting races, the key races that you are keeping an eye on in these primaries over the summer?
So there are still quite a few vigorous challenges by younger candidates to older Democratic House incumbents in multiple states across the country. And we have seen, really, ever since Trump's second victory in 2024, and maybe even before that with Biden having to drop out of the race, a real anger toward these Democratic incumbents, many of whom have held on for too long. And the calls for generational change have grown louder and louder. And so this is a theme that I think is very much worth paying attention to as we go forward with the remaining primaries. There are races in places like Connecticut, in Colorado, elsewhere, where we are seeing these kinds of challenges. And we've already seen a bunch. For a variety of reasons, there haven't been any particularly high profile successes from this new generation. But I want to note that in the California primary, we got a call on Tuesday night in the 7th Congressional District, where longtime Congresswoman Doris Matsui only got around 30% of the vote. Congresswoman Matsui did in the top 2 primary, and she has a very strong challenger from a member of the Sacramento City Council, Mai Vang, who actually is in first place in that race right now. It's difficult to say how this race will play out in a general election between 2 Democrats, but that is definitely one I'm keeping a close eye on.
Democrats have had enormous success in flipping districts ever since Donald Trump came back into office last year. I believe we're at about 30 flips during that time. And it's been interesting. It's been all across the country, in red districts, in blue districts, in states you wouldn't expect necessarily, down south, in Mississippi, onto the Midwest. And we've seen just a huge variety in terms of the candidates who have won. Some of them have been quite progressive, some have been moderates. What's your overall takeaway? Is it just general anger towards Donald Trump, and that's the through line, or what else might be at work in terms of who is winning and who isn't?
I think that there are so many motivating factors here for the Democratic success at the ballot box since Donald Trump returned to the White House. Among folks who you might say comprise the Democratic base, there is just obviously tremendous personal anger directed at Donald Trump for the way that he is shredding American democracy. But it's not just simply a matter of Democratic voters being particularly juiced up and energized to show up in these elections and Republican voters staying home, though that is definitely part of it. What you're also seeing is moderate voters, independents, and some Republicans actually switching sides. People who voted for Republicans in the last election or in previous elections actually saying, you know what, I'm very unhappy and I'm going to show up for this special election or for this local election and poll the Lieber for a Democrat, even if it's something they haven't done before. And for a lot of these folks, I think that they are motivated by extreme unhappiness over the economy, which is very appropriate and very deserved, because Donald Trump ran his entire campaign saying he was going to lower grocery prices on day one and there were going to be no more foreign wars. And instead, he has engaged in tactics that are just extremely inflationary all around, whether it's tariffs, the Iran war, mass deportations, which of course are an ugly, horrific human crisis, but also have an inflationary effect. And so for your average American who's already been stressed for so many years and squeezed by what is an unfair economy, Donald Trump is only making it worse. And we all remember, folks of our generation, remember Bill Clinton, his extremely successful deployment of the line, it's the economy, stupid. It still is in so many ways. It's not necessarily the number one motivator for every voter. And I think it's a mistake for Democrats to ignore other issues. There are some Democrats who want to say, oh, we just need to be laser focused on the economy. It's important to be very focused on the economy, but it's also important to focus on other issues as well. But the economy is still so overwhelmingly important. And, Trump won an election by promising to make it better. And now he's made it a lot worse. So, these birds are coming home to roost.
Well, Democrats seem to be facing very good odds to flip the House this fall, but increasingly there's optimism about taking the Senate as well, which was considered unthinkable at the beginning of this cycle. There's so much focus, obviously, on states like Maine and Alaska and North Carolina for Democrats to flip, even Texas. What are some of the races that you're keeping an eye on that could be sleeper races for the Senate?
Well, I certainly would include Ohio on that list. I don't think we can call that a sleeper, even though it's a red state, because Democrats recruited their strongest possible candidate, which of course is former Senator Sherrod Brown, who just lost a couple of years ago, ran well ahead of the top of the ticket, has been fundraising extremely well. I also want to add Iowa to the list. That's an open seat. Democrats nominated State Representative Josh Turek, who has a fascinating background. He is a Paralympic champion. He's facing Republican Congresswoman Ashley Hinson in that race. Another difficult race, but we were talking about those special elections. Democrats have done extremely well in half a dozen Iowa special elections since
Right.
Donald Trump came back to the White House. So I think that there is a chance there. Nebraska, another very interesting race because their Democrats have decided to unite around the independent candidacy of Dan Osborne, who also ran as an independent 2 years ago and did quite well. He lost by about 6 points, but again, ran ahead at the top of the ticket. Democrats aren't fielding a candidate in that race, with the understanding that an independent is much more likely to attract Republican-leaning voters than someone with a D after their name. So that's definitely another one. There's also outside chances of similar arrangements happening in a couple of other states, with Democrats maybe uniting around independent candidates. That hasn't quite happened yet. I would not completely rule out Florida. I know that that's where Democratic hopes have gone to die in recent years, but Florida has an appointed Republican senator, Ashley Moody. She's won statewide before, but she hasn't ever run for Senate before. And Democrats landed an interesting candidate in Alexander Vindman, who, of course, was famous for his role in the Trump's first impeachment regarding Ukraine. He's raised a lot of money. And so it's important to look at all these races, not necessarily because Democrats can or will flip all of them, but the wider the playing field is for Democrats, the better chance they have of flipping their top target races.
Right. And it causes Republicans to have to spend money in places
Exactly.
that they never would want to, like Florida and Texas.
No, that's exactly right. You have to play chess, not checkers. And you have to understand that there is a broad playing field and that a move in one corner of the country can affect things in another part of the country. And yeah, if you get tied down, being forced to spend $10 million or $50 million to defend a candidate that you didn't think you needed to defend, well, that may be money that can't go to another race that's even more vulnerable.
Well, David, thank you for spending so much time talking through all of these races with us. Again, tell everyone the best way that they can find your work.
Absolutely. You can find us at the-downballot.com. There you will find our newsletter. You can also find us on Blue Sky. We're also the-downballot.com there. But our newsletter on Substack, that's the best place to find us. Subscribe. It's free. You'll get us in your inbox 5 days a week at 8 a.m. Eastern sharp.
Great. Thank you again for being here. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well.
My pleasure.